Sarah had always dreamed of being a flight attendant ever since she was a little girl growing up in a small town far away from any big airports. She would watch planes fly across the sky and imagine herself high above the clouds smiling at passengers as she handed them snacks and drinks. Now, after years of hard work and sacrifice, she had finally made it. She had passed all the grueling tests, the interviews, and had earned her wings with a prestigious airline. Her first solo flight was a big deal. She had waited for this moment. For so long she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her uniform one last time. Before heading out the door, her nerves buzzed with excitement. She was ready for this. She had to be. This was her moment to prove herself. She boarded the plane with a smile on her face and a sense of pride in her chest. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she felt a rush of adrenaline. She had dreamed of this feeling for years. The hum of the engines beneath her feet, the buzz of passengers settling into their seats, the familiar sound of the intercom crackling as the captain announced the flight's details. It was all surreal. It was perfect. As the plane climbed higher into the sky and Sarah began her routine checks, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. But there was no time to rest. The crew was counting on her to stay sharp. There were passengers to attend to and 1,000 little details to manage. She moved gracefully up and down the aisles, making sure everyone was comfortable, offering drinks and snacks with a calm smile. She enjoyed the little moments, chatting with the regular travelers, hearing their stories, the small interactions that made the job worth it. She loved the way the cabin smelled, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the steady movement of the plane as it cruised through the sky. It felt like a dream. But Sarah knew the reality of being a flight attendant wasn't all glamorous. It was hard work, long hours and moments when the pressure was overwhelming. She had heard all the stories about difficult passengers and tough situations, but she had always believed she could handle whatever came her way. After all, she was trained for this. It was about an hour into the flight when Sarah first noticed the man. He was sitting in the middle of the cabin, a few rows up. His posture was tense, his eyes darting around the room. He was an older man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a dark suit. His face seemed familiar, but Sarah couldn't place him at first. He was staring at the seat in front of him, clearly agitated. When she made her rounds down the aisle to offer drinks, she passed by his seat. And that's when it happened. He suddenly raised his voice and called out loudly, demanding to speak with the captain or someone in charge. Sarah's eyes widened. As she tried to keep her composure, she approached his seat with a polite smile. But his words were sharp and angry. He was upset about his seat assignment and how he had been given a middle seat in economy when he should have been in first class. He insisted there was a mistake and that someone needed to fix it right away. The tone in his voice left no room for negotiation. Sarah's heart started to race as she tried to calm him down. She explained that the seating was assigned based on his ticket and that no changes could be made mid-flight. But the man wasn't listening. His voice grew louder and louder until a few passengers around him started to glance over in discomfort. Sarah could feel the tension rising in the air. She could hear the whispers behind her back and feel the stares of the other passengers. She had to handle this. She couldn't let the situation escalate. She knew she needed to act. But every time she spoke, he interrupted her. He called her incompetent and demanded a refund. His face was turning red with anger. She remained calm and polite, but inside she was starting to feel the pressure building. She had never dealt with a passenger this confrontational before, and as the minutes dragged on, it became clear this was not going to end peacefully. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. She couldn't let him disrupt the entire flight. There were rules for this. She knew what she had to do, but a part of her hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation even further. But the man was not giving her any choice. He continued yelling, and the other passengers were starting to murmur in concern. Sarah glanced around for help, but the rest of the crew was busy with other duties. There was no one else to intervene. The decision fell on her shoulders, and without thinking she did what she felt was right. She told the man that if he didn't calm down immediately, he would have to leave the flight at the next stop. She tried to keep her voice steady and professional, but she could hear the tremor in her own words. He glared at her for a moment, and then stood up abruptly, knocking his seat back and causing a commotion. He wasn't going to back down, and neither was she. It was happening fast, and before she knew it, she had made her decision to have him removed from the plane. Sarah stood her ground as the man stood up from his seat and began shouting even louder. He was clearly losing his temper, and as he raised his voice to demand answers from the crew, the rest of the cabin grew quiet. Sarah could feel the stares of the passengers on her back, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She had to act, but something inside her was screaming to back down. She could feel the anxiety rising in her chest, but she pushed it away. This was her job. She had been trained for this. The man continued to yell, his face red with anger, his words barely intelligible, as he called her every name in the book. Sarah took a deep breath. She had no choice now. She had to do what was necessary to protect the rest of the passengers and maintain order in the cabin. Her voice was steady as she repeated her warning to him. She told him if he didn't calm down immediately, she would have no choice but to remove him from the flight. The man stopped shouting for a brief moment, as if considering her words, but the silence didn't last long. Soon his fury was back tenfold. He swung around, his arms flailing in the air as he cursed her and demanded to speak to someone in charge. Sarah remained calm, but inside her heart was racing. Her fingers tingled as she realized she was facing a difficult decision. Would she be able to do this without making things worse? The man was not backing down. He was becoming more erratic, his anger growing by the second, and she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her every movement. They were watching to see what she would do next. Sarah's mind was spinning, but she knew one thing: she had to maintain control of the situation, or it could spiral out of hand quickly. She nodded at one of the other crew members who had been watching the scene unfold. She motioned for them to step in and help, but they were already preoccupied with other passengers. There was no backup. As the man continued shouting, Sarah moved closer to him, trying to keep her voice even and professional. She calmly told him that if he did not calm down immediately, he would be escorted off the flight and would not be allowed to continue to his destination. The man stopped in his tracks, his eyes flashing with fury. He was breathing heavily, as if he couldn't believe what she had just said. His lips curled into a sneer as he pointed his finger at her, accusing her of ruining his entire day. He couldn't believe someone like her would dare speak to him that way. It was clear now this wasn't just about the seat, it was about power and control, and he wasn't going to let go of either. Sarah's stomach tightened, but she held firm. There was no turning back now. She had done everything she could to talk him down, and nothing had worked. She needed to act swiftly or risk losing control of the entire flight. With a steady hand, Sarah reached for the intercom and made a calm but firm announcement that she needed assistance immediately. The passengers around her shifted nervously, their eyes darting from Sarah to the man, who was now pacing in agitation. The tension in the air was palpable. She could feel it pressing down on her chest. It was the kind of tension that makes you question everything you know. But Sarah pushed it aside. She wasn't going to let this situation define her. She had come too far to let it all slip away over a single disruptive passenger. The man's yelling reached a fever pitch now, his voice echoing through the cabin. He wasn't listening anymore. It was clear he had no intention of calming down. But Sarah wasn't backing down either. She signaled for the flight crew to step in. They were now aware of the gravity of the situation and quickly moved to her side. A few of them stepped forward to assist in escorting the man off the plane. But even with the backup, his resistance was immediate. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. And then it happened. The man turned to Sarah one last time, and with an angry gesture he grabbed his bag and stormed down the aisle towards the door. But just before he exited, he gave her one final glare, as if to say this wasn't over. he was going to make sure of it. The crew quickly followed behind him, and within minutes the man was off the plane. The tension in the cabin immediately lifted, but Sarah's mind was still racing. She had done what she had to do, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the man was escorted off the plane and the door closed behind him, Sarah felt a brief sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. The cabin was still and quiet now. Passengers resumed their seats, but the air was thick with unease. Sarah walked slowly down the aisle, her heart still racing. As she glanced at the crew members who had helped in removing the passenger, they gave her sympathetic looks, but there was no comfort in them. They were just as shaken by the incident as she was. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had done what she thought was right, but the reality of the situation was now settling in. She had kicked a passenger off the plane. It wasn't just any passenger either. It was someone who had caused a scene so loudly and publicly that it made everyone uncomfortable. But still there was a nagging thought at the back of her mind. Was there more to this than she realized? She glanced out of the window at the clouds below, the vast emptiness of the sky, as the plane flew smoothly onward, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She kept replaying the encounter in her head over and over, the way the man had lashed out at her so unexpectedly, the way he had refused to listen to reason, how his anger had escalated so quickly and with such intensity. But the worst part was she had no idea who he really was, just another upset passenger, right? That's what she told herself. But deep down she felt a strange unease, a sense that there was more to this situation than just a disrupted flight. She tried to push it aside. There was no time to dwell on it. She had to focus on the passengers and the rest of the flight. There was still work to be done. Sarah moved to the back of the cabin to check on a few passengers, making sure they were comfortable, offering drinks and snacks, trying to keep up the appearance of normalcy. But the nerves in her stomach wouldn't settle. She felt like everyone was watching her, like they knew something she didn't. Whispers started to travel through the cabin as passengers began to discuss what had just happened. She overheard a few comments about how crazy the situation was, how that man had been out of control. Sarah tried to smile and keep up the friendly demeanor she had learned in training, but she couldn't help feeling exposed. She didn't know if it was because of the scene that had just unfolded or the growing anxiety that something bigger was at play. As the flight continued, Sarah stayed on high alert. She checked the passengers, made sure everything was running smoothly, but her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. The man had been so angry, almost unreasonably so, and now she couldn't stop wondering who he really was. Why had he been so determined to get what he wanted, no matter the cost? It wasn't like any other passenger she had dealt with before. She had seen upset travelers in the past, but this felt different. Something about the way he carried himself, his confidence, his absolute refusal to back down, even when he was in the wrong, was unsettling. But it wasn't until the flight started its descent that Sarah noticed something strange, a soft murmur spreading through the cabin. She turned to one of the senior flight attendants who had been working near the front of the plane. Her face had turned pale, and her eyes were wide with disbelief. Sarah stepped closer to her, concerned. The senior attendant hesitated for a moment before speaking in a hushed voice. "Have you heard who that man was?" she asked. Sarah's stomach tightened. She shook her head, feeling the tension building again. "He's the CEO of the airline," the senior attendant whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah froze for a moment. Her heart skipped a beat. The CEO, the man she had just kicked off the plane, the very same man who had caused the scene and disrupted the flight, was the CEO of the airline she worked for. The thought hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The man who had yelled at her, called her incompetent, humiliated her in front of the passengers, was the one person she never would have expected to be in the seat of a disgruntled customer. The CEO, the leader of the company, the very man who held the power to shape her career. Sarah stood there frozen, her mind racing, trying to process the information. Was this some kind of mistake? Was there any chance it wasn't true? But the senior attendant's face told her everything she needed to know. The shock was clear in her eyes, the disbelief that such a powerful person had been traveling under an alias, and now Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her with every passing second. What had she done? Sarah's mind raced as the weight of the revelation sank in. She had just kicked off the CEO of the airline, and now everything seemed to be spinning out of control. She tried to steady her breath, but it was hard. Her hands felt clammy, and her legs weak. She looked around the cabin at the other crew members, who were busy with their duties, but there was no comfort in their faces. Everyone seemed to be going about their tasks with an almost eerie calm, as if they were all pretending like nothing had happened. Sarah felt like she was in a bubble, unable to hear anything beyond the pounding of her heart in her ears. She thought about the conversation she had with the CEO moments before she had removed him, how he had been so furious and unreasonable, how his anger had felt so personal. But it hadn't occurred to her then that this was the man who had the power to make or break her career. She had been focused only on doing her job, maintaining control, but now it seemed like that decision had been the worst mistake of her life. The plane began its final descent into the airport, and Sarah moved to the front of the cabin, feeling the eyes of the passengers following her every move. Some of them had already whispered among themselves. Some seemed to have an idea of who the angry man had been, but none of them had dared ask her directly. All she could think about now was the fallout from what had just happened. What would the airline say? What would her supervisor say? What would happen to her job? Would she be fired? Would they even let her explain the situation? As the plane landed, Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. The sound of the wheels touching the runway felt muffled in her ears, like everything around her had gone silent, except for the thudding of her own pulse. She stood at the front of the cabin greeting passengers as they prepared to exit the plane. Each handshake, each smile felt like an eternity. The faces of the passengers were a blur. They all seemed to have the same expression, a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some even shot her questioning looks, but no one said anything outright. Sarah could feel their judgment all around her. It was suffocating. Once the last of the passengers disembarked, Sarah took a deep breath and walked to the back of the plane to gather her things. She was shaking. Her hands were trembling as she placed her uniform into her bag, trying to ignore the overwhelming anxiety that was gnawing at her. She was trying to push away the thoughts of what had just happened, trying to ignore the fact that she had just kicked out the CEO of the airline, the very person who controlled her future at that moment. She didn't know what to expect when she walked off the plane. Would they call her into the office for an immediate meeting, or would she be fired on the spot? Before she could gather her thoughts, one of the senior flight attendants approached her with a serious look on her face. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What was going to happen now? The senior attendant motioned for Sarah to follow her, and Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. She couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a trap. She followed the attendant to the crew room, where she saw the supervisor waiting for her, his arms crossed, and his expression unreadable. Sarah stood in front of him, feeling like she was about to face judgment. But she had no idea how bad it was going to be. She tried to explain what had happened, how the man had been disruptive from the moment he boarded the flight, how she had tried to calm him down. But he had refused to listen. She told him how she had no choice but to remove him for the safety and well-being of the passengers. The supervisor listened carefully, but Sarah could see that his face was impassive. He didn't seem moved by her explanation. In fact, he looked almost as if he had already made up his mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, the supervisor spoke, but his words were like a punch to the gut. "We've received a report from the ground team," he said in a flat tone. "It seems the passenger you removed was not just any passenger, but the CEO of the airline." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment, the words he had spoken echoing in her mind over and over again. The CEO, she couldn't believe it. She had just kicked off the most powerful person in the company, and now her career was on the line. Sarah stood there frozen as the supervisor's words echoed in her mind. She had just kicked off the CEO of the airline, the very man who held her career in his hands. The shock hit her like a wave. She couldn't breathe for a moment. She couldn't process what was happening. She thought back to the moment when she had made the decision to have him removed. She had been so sure that it was the right thing to do. But now it felt like everything was crashing down around her. Her dream job, the one she had worked so hard for, it was all slipping away. Her stomach twisted into knots, and her palms began to sweat. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it pounding in her ears. The supervisor didn't say anything at first. He just stood there watching her, his arms still crossed, his gaze cold. And impassive Sarah tried to steady her breathing. But it was hard. She could feel the panic rising inside her. The weight of the situation was suffocating. She had no idea what was going to happen next. She had no idea if she would be able to keep her job, or if the CEO would have the final say in her fate. Would he understand why she had done it? Would he consider her actions justified? Or would he see her as a threat, someone who couldn't handle the pressure of the job? After what felt like an eternity, the supervisor finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Sarah's heart sink. "I understand that you thought you were doing the right thing," he said, his tone flat. "But I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. You have removed the CEO of the airline from this flight." He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "This is not just about one passenger. This is about the reputation of the company and the trust we place in our employees," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Sarah nodded, but she could barely comprehend his words. All she could think about was how everything had gone wrong. She had tried to do her job. She had tried to maintain order on the flight. And now she was facing the consequences of a decision she never thought would lead to this moment. The supervisor motioned for her to sit down, and she did so mechanically, her mind still reeling from the news. He continued to speak, but Sarah could barely focus on his words. She tried to concentrate, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the CEO, to the anger in his eyes when she had kicked him off the flight. She had seen the fury in his face, but she hadn't realized who he was at the time. She hadn't known that the man she had just humiliated in front of the entire cabin was the one person who held the power to destroy her career. The supervisor's voice broke through her thoughts again, and she snapped back to reality. "I'm not going to make any decisions right now," he said, "but this will be escalated to the highest level." He said his words final. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as the full weight of his words sank in. He wasn't going to fire her immediately, but the CEO would be the one to make the final decision on what happened next. Sarah felt as if the room had started spinning. She had no control over her fate. She had no idea what the CEO would do. Would he fire her on the spot? Would he want to make an example out of her, to show that no one was above the rules? She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, and how much was riding on the next few moments. Her career, her future. It was all in the hands of a man she had just kicked off a plane. The supervisor stood up as if to signal the end of their meeting. "I need you to stay here for now," he said. "I'll be in touch with you soon, and we'll let you know what happens next." With that, he left the room without another word. Sarah sat there alone, her hands trembling in her lap. The silence around her was deafening. She had no idea how long she sat there, or how long it would take before someone came back to give her an answer. But all she could do was wait and wonder how it had all gone so horribly wrong. Sarah sat in the sterile crew room feeling as though time had stopped. She couldn't focus on anything. Her mind was consumed with the events that had unfolded. The image of the CEO's angry face flashing in her thoughts over and over again. She kept replaying the moment she had asked him to leave the flight, his furious response, how the whole situation had spiraled out of control. And now she was waiting for someone to come back and tell her what was going to happen next. The silence in the room was unbearable. She couldn't escape the feeling that her future was hanging by a thread. And there was nothing she could do about it. She had done everything she thought was right. But now she wasn't so sure anymore. Had she overstepped? Had she misjudged the situation? Had she ruined everything she had worked so hard for? The minutes felt like hours, and Sarah couldn't stop fidgeting in her seat, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the table, her thoughts racing. She tried to calm herself, but it was impossible. Her entire body was on edge. Every part of her felt tense and alert. The more she thought about what had happened, the more she questioned her decision. She had never imagined this kind of situation would happen to her. She had always been so careful, so aware of the rules, so determined to do her job well. She had always believed that her hard work would protect her from anything, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. The door to the crew room opened, and Sarah snapped her head toward it. Her heart jumped into her throat. As the supervisor entered the room, his face was serious, and his steps purposeful. Sarah stood up instinctively, her body tensing. As she waited for him to speak, her breath caught in her chest, the weight of the moment settling in like a heavy fog around her. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. The supervisor walked to the front of the room and motioned for her to sit back down. Sarah complied, her mind still racing, her palms slick with sweat. She couldn't help but feel like she was being led to the gallows. The supervisor didn't sit down. Instead, he stood in front of her, his arms crossed, and his eyes narrowed. It was clear that he had been briefed on the situation, and Sarah could feel the pressure mounting with each passing second. He cleared his throat and spoke in a measured tone. "I've spoken to the higher-ups," he said, his voice low and controlled. Sarah's stomach churned as she waited for him to continue. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the supervisor looked directly at her. "The CEO is furious," he said, his words striking Sarah like a slap in the face. But it wasn't over yet. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts spinning out of control as she waited for the rest of the sentence. But then the supervisor paused, and Sarah could see something in his eyes, something that made her blood run cold. "We've decided to conduct a full review of your actions," he continued. "The company will be investigating everything that led up to the incident, and that includes looking at your behavior during the flight and your decision to remove the CEO from the plane." He paused again, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. "I have to be honest with you," he said. "It's not looking good for you." The words hit Sarah harder than anything she had heard up until that point. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. She was reeling, trying to process everything he had just said. What did this mean? Would they fire her? Would they suspend her? Would they even give her a chance to explain herself? She didn't know. But the uncertainty was almost worse than knowing the worst possible outcome. At least then she could prepare for it. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had so many questions, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. The supervisor seemed to sense her silence and added, "We're going to give you a chance to explain yourself," he said, his voice softer now. "But that doesn't mean it will change anything," he warned her. "We need to know why you made the decision you did, and whether it was justified or not. But don't expect it to be easy. We can't just overlook something like this. You've caused a major disruption, and you need to be prepared for the consequences of your actions." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her bones. She had no idea what would happen next, no idea if she could keep her job, or if this was the end of her career. But she knew one thing for sure: nothing was ever going to be the same again. Sarah walked out of the crew room with her mind swirling, her heart still racing, as the weight of the supervisor's words lingered in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that her career was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. The uncertainty gnawed at her with every step she took. The next few days felt like a blur as she waited for the official investigation to begin. She had tried to distract herself with normal tasks, but everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, as if time had slowed down just to torment her. She knew she couldn't avoid the inevitable. She had to face the consequences of her actions. But she couldn't stop hoping that somehow everything would work out, that she would be given a second chance, that the CEO would understand and forgive her. But deep down she knew it was unlikely. She had kicked him off the plane. She had humiliated him in front of the passengers. She couldn't erase that mistake. And no matter how hard she tried to justify her decision, she knew the damage had been done. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she froze for a moment, hesitating before she took it out. It was an email from HR. Her stomach lurched as she opened it, her hands trembling. As she read the message, it was an official notice to attend a meeting with the executive team and the CEO himself. She stared at the words for a moment, unable to process what she was reading. She had known this was coming, but now that it was real, she felt the world closing in around her. She was going to face the man she had kicked off the plane, and now she had to explain herself to him, explain why she had taken the action she did, when all she had wanted was to protect the passengers and keep order on the flight. But how could she make him understand? How could she make him see that she wasn't trying to disrespect him, that she had only been doing her job? The meeting was scheduled for the next day, and Sarah barely slept the night before her mind kept racing through all the things she could say and all the ways it could go wrong. She had gone over the details of the flight again and again in her head. She had tried to think of every angle, every possible way she could explain herself, but nothing seemed good enough. Nothing seemed like it would change the fact that she had made an irreversible decision. She had been the one to call the shots, and now she had to face the consequences. When Sarah walked into the meeting room the next day, her legs felt like jelly. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in her life. The executive team was already seated around the long conference table, and at the far end of the room sat the CEO, his gaze cold and unwavering. As he looked at her, she tried to hold her head high to show confidence. But it was hard when she felt like she was about to be torn apart. She took a seat across from the CEO and immediately felt the tension in the room. It was thick and suffocating, and she could feel every pair of eyes on her waiting for her to speak. The CEO broke the silence, first his voice calm, but firm. He asked her to explain what had happened on the flight. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events leading up to the incident. She explained how the passenger had been disruptive from the start, how she had tried to calm him down, how she had done everything by the book to de-escalate the situation, but nothing had worked. She told them about the safety concerns she had for the other passengers, and how she had been left with no choice but to remove him from the flight. She spoke honestly and without hesitation, hoping that her words would be enough. But as she finished her explanation, she couldn't help but notice the look on the CEO's face. It was unreadable, and that made her heart drop further into her stomach. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at her with that same cold gaze. She couldn't tell if he was angry or if he was calculating his next move, but it felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. When he did, his words were measured and sharp. It was clear he had been briefed on the situation, and he was not pleased with what he had heard. "You have disrupted the entire flight," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You have embarrassed me in front of the passengers and crew, and you have shown a lack of judgment that I cannot ignore." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. She could barely breathe as he continued to speak about the impact of her actions on the airline's reputation and how it would be difficult for the company to overlook such an incident. She could feel the weight of each word he spoke, as if they were crushing her under their weight. But then something unexpected happened. The CEO paused and looked directly at her for the first time. His expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. Then he spoke again. "We'll consider this a warning," he said, his voice still firm, but with a hint of understanding. "But let me be clear, if anything like this ever happens again, you will not have a job here. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded quickly, too relieved to speak. She had been given a second chance. but she knew she would have to work harder than ever to prove herself again. Sarah sat in the meeting room, staring at the CEO, trying to process what had just happened. She had been given a second chance. But the weight of the warning still hung heavily in the air. Her hands were shaking. But she managed to hold her composure. The tension in the room was thick. And she knew that this moment would be a turning point in her career. She had narrowly escaped losing everything. But it didn't feel like a victory. She felt like she was walking on eggshells, one wrong move, and she could lose it all. She had been so sure of herself when she had asked the disruptive passenger to leave the flight. But now she questioned every decision, every action she had taken. Since the moment she had walked onto that plane, she had made a snap judgment based on the situation, but it hadn't been enough to save her from the consequences. As the meeting ended, Sarah left the room, her mind still spinning. She walked down the hallway, feeling like she was in a daze. She couldn't quite believe she had survived the encounter. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the fear that it was only a matter of time before something else went wrong. The weight of the CEO's gaze still lingered in her mind, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she would always be under scrutiny now. Every move she made would be watched, every decision would be questioned. She had been given a second chance, but it felt like she had been marked. Somehow she had made an enemy of the most powerful person in the company, and now she had to work twice as hard to prove herself. Sarah took a deep breath as she stepped outside the building into the cool air. The world felt different. Somehow everything seemed quieter and more distant. She felt like she had just narrowly escaped a nightmare. But now she had to live with the consequences of her actions every day. She knew that if anything ever went wrong again, she wouldn't get another chance. She had been lucky this time. But luck wasn't something she could rely on. She had to be perfect from now on. The next few days were a blur of nervous energy and self-doubt. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but it was difficult knowing that the entire company was aware of what had happened. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some passengers still looked at her with suspicion, and she couldn't blame them. She had kicked the CEO off a flight, and though the company had kept the incident quiet, there were still murmurs among the crew, and even some of the pilots had asked her about the situation in hushed voices. It felt like every corner of her life was affected by that one decision she had made, and she wasn't sure how long it would take before people stopped looking at her as the flight attendant who had kicked off the CEO. Then one day a week after the incident, Sarah was called into the supervisor's office once again. She felt a pit form in her stomach as she walked down the hallway. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Had they decided to fire her? After all, had they just been giving her false hope, only to pull the rug out from under her? She pushed the door open and sat down across from her supervisor, who had a more serious look than usual. Sarah's heart started to race, but she tried to remain calm. She couldn't afford to lose control. Now she had already come this far. The supervisor cleared his throat before speaking. Sarah, we've received a report from the CEO himself, and while it's not easy to admit, we've decided that you're not at fault here. He said. His voice was measured and calm, but Sarah could hear the hesitation in his words. We understand that you were trying to manage a difficult situation, and while the outcome wasn't ideal, we've decided to let you continue working here, he continued. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but at the same time she felt a sense of disbelief. It felt too good to be true. After everything she had gone through to get to this point, she had expected the worst, and now she was being told she still had a chance to redeem herself. The supervisor's tone softened a bit as he continued. But I need you to understand this is a final warning. If anything like this happens again, we will not hesitate to let you go, he said. Sarah nodded quickly, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had survived this time, but she knew she couldn't afford to make another mistake. Sarah left the office feeling a strange mixture of relief and fear. She had been given a second chance, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. She had to prove herself. Now more than ever she had been lucky, but luck wouldn't always be on her side, and she couldn't let her guard down again. The weight of the warning hung over her as she stepped back into the busy hallways of the airport, her mind still racing with the realization that she had narrowly escaped disaster. But now she knew the truth. The real challenge had only just begun.